Wisconsin was, correct me if I'm wrong, but I probably know this because you and I have talked about it. You probably told me this in the past. Wisconsin was sort of the laboratory. It was like, this is where we're going to run the pilot program and see if this is going to be something that we can export to other states. This is like every ALEC piece of legislation that was ever written. We're going to try it first in Wisconsin. And one of the things that the Republicans have done and sort of like innovated in Wisconsin, right? Like you mentioned the gerrymandering, and we should say that was, if I'm not mistaken, it was Thomas Hofeller, who's considered the godfather of Republican gerrymandering. This was one of the first places he rolled it out, where they had the technology to sort of get down to the point where, and you can tell us the numbers about how just sort of like how completely warped democracy is there. But Republicans have always been very good at being disciplined about getting into office, and their first moves are always not about like, we're going to cut taxes, we're going to do that. Their first moves are always like, what can we do to enhance our ability to get elected in the future? And that means cutting union power. That means gerrymandering. They, when Evers gets elected, they just cut his authority. And then we see that happen in North Carolina. We see these things, these things sort of exported around the country. Give us a sense of just how warped democracy is in Wisconsin because of those gerrymandering.
Well, Sam, you've learned your Wisconsin lessons well. Wisconsin
at your feet, essentially.
I don't know. Wisconsin has historically been referred to as the laboratory of democracy. Going back more than a century, it's the state where innovations, frankly, on the right and the left, have come from. Wisconsin leading on workers' comp and protections for women in the workplace, voting rights, all sorts of things. But then when the Republicans came to power, you're right. They came in and they did a lot of their playbook right away. They disempowered the trial lawyers, a group that often supports Democrats. They disempowered unions, a group that usually supports Democrats. They disempowered all sorts of other groupings around the states. They changed the election dates for primaries so that the election dates for primaries would occur in the summer when students are not at university. I mean, you just run down the list. It's endless. And so they did all this, and it worked, especially the gerrymandering worked. In 2008, the Democrats won a solid majority in the state legislature. In 2010, they lost it. That was a very normal pattern in Wisconsin. Wins and losses, the legislature flipping back and forth. Since 2010, when the Republicans took charge and they then gerrymandered the maps, the Democrats have not controlled the legislature. And in fact, this is to give you an example. In several election cycles, Democrats won statewide, sometimes very, very comfortably by large margins. They even won the cumulative vote for the state legislature, and yet they did not only didn't they get control of the legislature was almost 2/3 Republican. So understand that. The majority of people who go to vote for state legislators vote for Democrats, and yet Republicans come out with a 2/3 majority, or virtually 2/3 majority. That is gerrymandering in the extreme, and it has lasted no matter what. When Barack Obama won Wisconsin overwhelmingly in 2012, Republicans still kept their majority. In 2018, when Democrats won every statewide race, senator, governor, lieutenant governor, secretary of state, state treasurer, attorney general, they won every statewide race, Republicans maintained the same level of control in the legislature. So that's the thing to understand here, is that the gerrymandering has given them, basically a free pass. And then the key to the Supreme Court race today, why today's Supreme Court race matters so much, is that in 2018 and then again in 2022, Tony Evers won for governor. Once Tony Evers won for governor, in the traditional model, you would have had a division between the Democratic governor, Republican legislature. They would have sorted out legislative district maps and congressional maps. It would have been a compromise. Instead, the Republicans refused to compromise. Even when Evers tried to, the case got thrown into the Supreme Court, where conservatives who are closely aligned to the Republicans had control of the maps, and they effectively drew maps that maintained the same Republican control. The only thing that will undo this, the only thing that will move Wisconsin back toward an actual democracy, where wherever you live, your vote has some meaning and it counts, is if the court flips tonight. If you get a 4-3 liberal majority on that court and a case challenging the gerrymandered maps comes up, if that court revisits it and draws new fair maps, not gerrymandered maps, but fair maps where there's real competition, then suddenly you could have a situation much like what happened in Michigan when they got rid of their gerrymandered maps and Democrats take control of the governorship, other statewide offices, and the legislature. And notably in Michigan, just in recent weeks, they've gotten rid of their right to work law. They've gotten rid of their other anti-labor laws. They began to push major civil rights and women's rights protections, including on abortion rights. All of that becomes possible if the court flips tonight.
Well, that was going to be my next question. Go ahead, Sam, though.
Well, we should say Michigan also a battleground state. I mean,
yeah,
so
same model.
This race has implications. I mean, that's why it has both implications in terms of like nationally. It's also like a bellwether, and it's going to give us an assessment of like, how, where the coalition that will elect the progressive stands. I mean, that's what's so fascinating about Wisconsin.
And let me throw one more thing into the mix. Not only are the legislative district maps gerrymandered, so are the congressional district maps. Wisconsin used to send a mixed congressional delegation, usually a little more Democratic in many years. Now the delegation is 6-2 Republican, overwhelmingly Republican. With fair maps for congressional districts, you could have as many as 2, maybe even on an outside chance, 3 new Democratic members of Congress. Look at how closely the House of Representatives is divided right now. Wisconsin, if there were fair maps, could play a critical role in 2024 in flipping control of the House back to the Democrats. That's how much is at stake.
And just in terms of the statewide implications for that abortion ban, I mean, it's not necessarily a trigger law, right? The 1849 abortion ban, but there's a challenge being leveled against it at this current moment. I mean, between right to work laws potentially codifying the right to an abortion within the state of Wisconsin, what else would be at the top in your estimation of the Democrats' priorities were they to take back the state government, and then much like in Michigan, you could kind of pass these agenda items through fairly immediately, making just congealing progressive priorities within the state.
Yeah, you're exactly right. Now, first off, remember the Supreme Court race is a officially nonpartisan race, but it's very clear who the Democratic Party's backing, who the Republican Party's backing. So right off the bat, if you got a 4-3 liberal majority on the state Supreme Court, they could probably take a case as regards our 1849 abortion law, and potentially that's the end of that law, right? So even before you get to redrawing maps, that's a huge deal for women's rights and reproductive rights in Wisconsin. They could theoretically also take cases involving Walker's anti-labor laws, particularly for public employees. Again, those laws were pushed by Walker, but they were sealed. The deal was sealed on the state Supreme Court. So if you can undo that, there are just things that can happen on the court itself that are fundamental. But if you then draw fair maps, if they're quickly drawn and they come into play for the 2024 election, then in that election, you have the possibility, not the guarantee, but the possibility that, like Michigan, Wisconsin could end up with a Democratic legislature, a Democratic governor. Then I think what you'd see very quickly is an overturning of the right to work law in Wisconsin, which is actually an anti-labor law, much like what happened in Michigan. And then I think you'd see something else which is really significant. There's been a chipping away at voting rights in Wisconsin. They moved, as I said, primary dates. They have made it harder to do many kinds of early voting. There have been all sorts of little assaults on voting rights. Many of them have been directed at students on college campuses across the state. Wisconsin has a lot of college campuses. So just reversing some of that, frankly, could have a fundamental impact on the 2024 presidential race, congressional races, and legislative races in Wisconsin. So you see very quickly some of those structural changes that begin to restore democracy. And remember, there have been some studies that say Wisconsin is less democratic than many countries around the world, which we do not look at as particularly healthy democracies. We've got a real mess in Wisconsin. So the simple restoration of voting rights, fair elections, fair maps is a huge deal. And then from that, you're right. And then, Emma, you get all the other things, right? You get better funding of the university, better funding of public education, fair deal on a whole bunch of environmental issues. It all comes together because Tony Evers, notably, is, I would argue, one of the 2 or 3 most progressive governors in Wisconsin. So give Governor Evers a legislature, and you've got, incredible possibilities.
And we should say also, I'm seeing from an IMer that there's a race in the 8th Senate District special election, which is one that could prevent the Republicans from getting a supermajority. Is that right?
Yes. And Sam, I'm so glad that you brought this up. I mean, I love this show because this is a show where we actually go a little deeper and get the actual story all laid out. And I won't go long on this because it's a bit complicated. But the simple reality is that in both houses of the legislature, Republican gerrymandered maps have brought them to the verge of a 2/3 majority. If they have a 2/3 majority, they can override Tony Evers' vetoes. Now, they don't have that in the assembly yet. So getting a 2/3 majority in the Senate wouldn't give them complete control, but it would put them in a position where just 1 or 2 Democratic members of the state assembly weren't there someday, they could push a law through, or they could push a veto override through. Senate could then kick it in. So it's a very tenuous situation there. But there's something bigger, Sam, and this is the biggest deal, and Emma as well. If the Republicans win the race in the special election, the 8th state Senate district, which is an open seat, if they win that seat, they will have 2/3 majority in the Senate. If they have 2/3 majority in the Senate, then the assembly, with just a 50-50 majority, just a 1 vote over 50, they don't have to have 2/3 there. The assembly could impeach an elected official in Wisconsin, say the Milwaukee County District Attorney, who they hate. And then the Senate could try and remove that official. So that's how big a deal this 1 seat is for the state Senate. It could allow the Republicans to commit even higher levels of abuses than we've seen up to this point. And there is a possibility that they might, for instance, target, as I said, the Milwaukee County District Attorney, John Chisholm. They might, who's been a rather progressive DA. They might also target Secretary of State Sarah Godlewski, who was recently appointed. They didn't like the fact that she was appointed. They could theoretically go after her. They could actually even go after a judge on the Supreme Court.
Right.
So that's why, although this race in the 8th district has not gotten a lot of national attention, it's a very big deal.